What I do understand more as I study this topic is how the subjective experiences of people differ across different IQ levels. For someone with an IQ below about 85, the world is a very puzzling place. And that's something that people at the average abilities or high abilities really don't understand because they don't have any firsthand experience in it. Someone who's significantly below average, they often have difficulty making choices that to you and me seem natural. Well, of course, I shouldn't party tonight. I have a test tomorrow, so I need to get to bed and not be drunk and wake up tomorrow with a hangover. That to you and me is obvious. That's not so obvious to someone with an IQ of 75 or 80.
Dr. Russell T. Warne, Associate Professor of Psychological Testing and Human Intelligence at Utah Valley University. Carneus Perda. My name is Bis, B-I-S. I'm a journalist from the world of artificial machines with the goal of investigating human natural intelligence. 1. Tell me an example of human intelligence happening.
There are many places that human intelligence happens. In fact, I think it permeates most things that people do. Something as simple as buckling up when you buckling up your seatbelt when you drive a car, taking your medication correctly, succeeding in school. We often don't think of some of these things as requiring intelligence, but they do. You wouldn't wear your seatbelt unless you cognitively figured out that the benefits of doing so outweigh the drawbacks. The harder question would be to find something that doesn't involve intelligence in some way, because it does permeate most of life.
2. Tell me an example of a lack of human intelligence happening.
That's really hard to do because intelligence does permeate so much in life, but there are a few things that I do think probably don't relate much to intelligence. I think that being able to feel love for family members or for a spouse is probably pretty cognitive free. If you want to get even more basic than that, being able to engage in autonomic bodily functions like using the restroom, eating, breathing, enjoying sex. I think all those things probably don't require much, if any, brain power.
3. Definition of intelligence.
For me, the definition of intelligence is the ability to reason, to think, to plan, to act. It's the ability to use a person's cognitive ability to navigate the world and to fulfill goals and to meet the requirements of their environment. I wrote an entire book talking about 35 different myths about intelligence, and there are a lot of misconceptions people have. I think there's a couple of different reasons. One is that, quite simply, the psychologists aren't teaching this. I did a study on course catalogs at universities in the United States and on introductory psychology textbooks, and both showed that intelligence was either not covered very well, or in the case of a lot of courses at all, that a lot of the textbooks had incorrect information, or a lot of the classes were based on incorrect theories. So I think some of it's psychology's fault. We know more about intelligence than almost anything else psychologists study. We know more about intelligence and what it is than we do about, for example, depression. And so I think some of it's the fault of psychologists for not getting accurate information out there, not teaching the courses, not spreading the word. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I think another reason is I have young children, and I know Santa Claus isn't real, but I don't have the heart to tell them that. They like the myth of Santa Claus. It brings them joy and happiness. And honestly, it keeps them in line a little bit. Hey, behave, Santa's watching. You want to be on the nice list this year? Parents like it. Well, a lot of these myths about intelligence make us feel better about ourselves and about the world. Assuming that a person lives in a wealthy country with access to schooling, probably half or more of the reason why some people are smarter than others is because of their genes. And right now, there's no good technology for editing those genes. And so it can feel a little fatalistic sometimes. Multiple intelligences, it's a nice little story that we tell so that we can feel like everybody's intelligent in at least one area. And it's kinder, it makes you feel better than the truth does, which is that no, in general, people who do well in one cognitive area tend to do well in others. And so I think some of it is happy talk, making others feel good about themselves and not wanting to dispel the myth or being that unpopular person at a party who says, no, what you're saying is wrong. I think there's a couple of reasons, but on the plus side, it means there's a market for the book. One of the places I'm most unpopular is presenting at education conferences with teachers, elementary, middle school, high school teachers, because a lot of what I'd say contradicts what they learned in their education training, their teacher training. It doesn't jive well with the culture of K to 12 education in the US. And I end up being a party pooper at those conferences. I think there's some spheres of society where things would be more efficient and would improve, and others where it wouldn't make a difference. A good example is where it wouldn't make a difference is in K to 12 education. I think that the evidence is really strong that a child with an IQ of 80 is never going to master calculus, no matter how much everyone tries. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't educate those people. And in the United States and in most other developed nations, there are laws saying we have to educate every child to the best of our ability. And no scientific finding is going to change that legal mandate or that moral and ethical imperative. Just because a child can't master calculus doesn't mean we shouldn't send them to school at all. So I think in some areas it's not really going to change anything. In areas where I think it will change more if everybody reads the book and internalizes the myths and believes what I say, is more areas of public policy related to things like the welfare state, to government policies about unemployment, for example. I think the evidence is overwhelming that there are people out there who will struggle to have a decent standard of living without government help. If we identify that, we can say, hey, look, let's stop the guilt trip. Some people aren't on welfare because they're lazy. Conversely, I think there's a lot of government waste about, for example, employment training. There was a big push in the United States about 10 years ago about how coal miners, when their mining jobs are shut down because the government doesn't want us burning coal and putting carbon into the atmosphere. Well, they should just learn to code. Go become a web program. Just learn to code. And no, people are not interchangeable cogs who can just pick up any job if they're taught to do so. And I think a lot of job training programs are a huge waste. And in the US, we have dozens, if not hundreds of them. Society could run more efficiently if we say, okay, we still need a welfare state so people don't starve in the streets, but let's stop this charade of trying to train people for jobs they'll never qualify for. Let's cut these programs and let's take the money to pay for these subsidies, and voila, we have a more efficient government. That's where I think the sort of policies could be more helpful. There's probably some things that people believe that don't do any harm but don't do any good. They're a placebo belief. It's probably not harmful but probably not beneficial if people have Dumbo's magic feather and have more confidence when they go into a job interview. Fine. Doesn't hurt me, doesn't cost much. But there are ideas, initiatives that do cost a lot of time and money. A good classic example is from a European psychologist whose last name was Erickson. He said that if we just engage in 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, anybody can be an expert in any field. That's not true. For most people, if you, depending on how many hours a day you devote to it, we're talking about 3 to 15 years of deliberate practice. He says, look, you can be a concert violinist, you could be a professional golfer, you can be a rocket scientist. It just takes 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. And That's not true. And there are people who have quit their jobs to go to the golf course and they say to themselves, okay, in 3 years, I'll be good enough to be a professional golfer and I'll earn money playing golf, which is what I like to do. And there are people who say, okay, I'm going to force my child to play the flute for 4 hours every day. And by the time they're a teenager, they'll be playing at Carnegie Hall. Forcing people or foregoing your job to do these things when it takes more than just deliberate practice to become an expert can cause a lot of harm. When people start saying, okay, everyone needs to do 10,000 hours of practice, or in the education system, we need to put every child in the honors class. Some kids aren't ready for that. And just believing that every child's smart is not going to make it so. And yet we see initiatives like that in the United States every year, and inevitably they fail. The exact number that someone gets on an intelligence test, the exact IQ score they get, probably doesn't matter much. Like all psychological tests, in fact, like all medical tests, there is a little bit of error. It's not unusual for those tests to be off by a couple points in either direction. For most purposes, people don't need to know their IQ. What I think is more important is to push oneself cognitively. And so I tell children, hey, enroll in the hardest classes that you can handle. Give yourself a cognitive challenge. For adults, yeah, try to learn a new skill. Try to pick up a challenging technical book or literary work. In free societies where people have options, a lot tend to self-select into the cognitive environments where they can succeed. But I do think that it's good to push your mind, to stretch a little bit. IQ or intelligence is an extremely good marker for things like job success, being able to train people for a new job performance later, but it's not everything. If you do find an employee and somehow you know that their intelligence is, their IQ is 145, woo, 3 standard deviations above average. We are in the territory of about 1 in 1,000 people. Yeah, they probably could learn any job. They have the brain power to pick up any job that they want to, but intelligence isn't everything. And we also have to worry about, for example, interest. I probably could have gone into business. I probably could have been an accountant. I'm good with numbers, but oh my gosh, I have zero interest in that. I would be bored to death with accounting work. If I got that job, I wouldn't be very good at it. I would always be daydreaming. I'd be checking my Facebook account. I'd be distracted. I wouldn't have the attention to detail because I just don't care. You also have to worry about the differences for other cognitive abilities for that person. I can show this on a figure really quick. We have general intelligence up here at the top. That is the ability that, like I said, permeates pretty much almost everything we do in life. And then beneath it, we have a bunch of broad abilities that aren't as general. So this is where we have spatial ability, the ability to deal with things in 2 or 3 dimensions. We have verbal ability, a person's ability to work with verbal stimuli like other languages or synonyms, grammar, etc. And we might have mathematical reasoning. We might have processing speed, how quickly you can think, etc. Most people have some of these that are stronger than others. My spatial reasoning is awful. I passed intro to chemistry as a college student by the skin of my teeth. The idea that some people can see a chemical formula and then imagine what the molecule looks like in their head in 3 dimensions boggles my mind. I'm lucky I live in a town where the big mountains are in the east, the little mountains are in the west, and it's impossible to get lost. But my verbal reasoning is better. That's why I wrote a book. It's why I'm in psychology, where we deal with words a lot more. And so we also have to look at a person's relative strengths and weaknesses, and that matters a lot too.
4. Subjective experience of your own intelligence.
My conscious experiences are mine. I don't know how similar they are to other people's. And I don't know whether my experiences are unique or not. What I do understand more as I study this topic is how the subjective experiences of people differ across different IQ levels. Someone like yourself, who is highly educated, it can be really hard to understand what the world is like for a person with an IQ of 80. Would have struggled a lot to even graduate from high school. For common tasks, is often baffled, who does not understand, for example, why getting a COVID shot that makes you sick for a day or two is better than getting the disease and not being sick for a couple of weeks. For someone with an IQ below about 85, the world is a very puzzling place. And that's something that people at the average abilities or high abilities really don't understand because they don't have any firsthand experience in it. The connection between their actions now and consequences that happen years down the road is very difficult to understand. This is why teenagers who are smarter than average, they very rarely smoke. They understand if I smoke today, I might get addicted, and decades down the road, I might die from cancer. They can make that connection. A teenager with an IQ of 80 has a lot more difficulty understanding why doing something today may have consequences way down the road. Someone with an IQ below about 85 or so really has difficulty understanding how voting in an election today might impact my life later. And someone who's significantly below average, has difficulty understanding a lot of those cause and effect connections in society. They have difficulty understanding why paying taxes means that they can catch a bus or a subway to where they need to go. I don't know what my subjective experience is, and I can't explain that to a computer, but I have noticed more and more that among humans, smarter people make connections, they understand cause and effect better, and that the world makes a lot more sense to them than it does to someone who's less intelligent. And they often have difficulty making choices that to you and me seem natural. Well, of course I shouldn't party tonight. I have a test tomorrow. So I need to get to bed and not be drunk and wake up tomorrow with a hangover. That to you and me is obvious. That's not so obvious to someone with an IQ of 75 or 80.
5. How can humans increase their intelligence?
When I was in graduate school, my older brother visited me because he had a job interview nearby. So I was taking him on a tour of the town and stuff. And his wife was pregnant with their first child. And he said, "Hey, you study that intelligence, that IQ stuff. What can I do to make my kid smart?" So, yes, I've asked this a lot. Assuming a child already lives in a wealthy nation, already is not experiencing abuse or neglect of some sort in a standard family where their lives aren't in danger, they're not being harmed. We don't know. We do know that environment matters. And I talk about this in my book. Environment definitely matters. For all the genetic influences on IQ, environment still matters. The best evidence of this is adoption studies. Depending on the country and the sample and the methodology and the statistics, adoption seems to raise the IQ of children by about 3 to 5 points, which is something. That's enough to make a difference in people's lives. But we don't know specifically what it is that the adoptive parents are doing. We don't know whether it's the access to healthcare. We don't know. There are 1,000 ways that parents who are eligible to adopt vary from those who are not. Adding to the complexity is the fact that we don't even know why within a family some kids are smarter than others beyond their genes. People are trying to figure this out, but it's hard. If it were just a matter of Oh, wealthy families eat more vegetables. And so if we give asparagus to poor kids, they'll get smarter. Uh, If it were something that simple, I think we would have found it by now, but we don't know. We do know that growing up in a more impoverished nation can lower IQ. We know that from international adoptions. Immigrants from developing nations, when they come to wealthy nations and have children in those wealthy nations, the children score higher in IQ tests than their parents do. And that can't be genetic because the kids got their genes from their parents. It must be totally environmental. We know that some nutrient deficiencies can lower IQ, especially iodine, and during the prenatal period, folic acid. Withholding school lowers IQ. We know all sorts of things that lower IQ. But when my brother said, "Hey, how can I make my kids smart?" I said, because my brother, he's now an optometrist. His wife's a landscape architect. They're not going to live in a dangerous neighborhood. The kids are already going to go to, good schools. Both parents are college educated. My brother was doing already all the things that adoptive parents do. And so the best I can say is try to have an environment for your child that looks like an environment that the government or a social service agency would allow you to adopt a child into that environment. As far as cultural issues, we have a lot of guesses, but we don't know for sure. Probably one of the strongest ones is study time. In the United States, there's certain racial and ethnic groups that tend to have their children study more than others. And so that's probably one cultural effect that can impact IQ. But I really have no idea whether, for example, learning how to eat rice with chopsticks makes you smarter than learning how to eat meat with a fork. A lot of the cultural things we really have no idea because they're confounded with so many other things, like the neighborhoods people live in, how many generations they've lived in the country, etc. Schools should select children for gifted programs, just as they should select children for special education programs. The whole idea behind these programs is the understanding that an education designed for the typical child does not work very well for children at the extremes. In the United States, education is decided at the local level, and the gifted program in one town, in one district, may be completely different from the gifted program in the neighboring district. And then because it's impossible for a school to provide every possible program, there are going to be some kids who have needs and interests that aren't met by the school. And that's where the parents or community programs can pick up the slack. For children and teenagers, having smarter friends does seem to expose them to more complex ideas and things. But for adults, probably doesn't matter much. But I do think it's important that people do mingle and have interactions, and if possible, friends who are at a wide variety of cognitive levels, because in wealthy nations, it is so easy, without even trying, to live your life day to day and only have meaningful interactions with people who are approximately as smart as you, because no human interacts with a representative sample of the species. We all interact a little more with people like us, even if it's as basic as living in a country, and so you tend to interact with your fellow countrymen. The fact that there's certain neighborhoods that cluster together based on socioeconomic status, it becomes really easy to ensconce yourself into a bubble where people are a lot like you. Unfortunately, I'm guilty of this. As a university professor, most of my coworkers have doctorate degrees. They're all really smart people. A lot of them are smarter than me. It's really easy for me to think, oh, well, everyone can understand, for example, why my government recently issuing a lot of stimulus checks to people to get through the pandemic is now last year is now causing inflation this year. Oh, that to me is easy. Everyone understands this. Well, no. In the book, I strongly suggest that people find ways to interact with others who are outside of their cognitive level, because it will bring a lot more sympathy for people. Well, if you have an IQ of 130 and you don't know anybody on welfare, then yeah, you can think that they must be lazy. But if these are people that you know, if they are your neighbors, if they are your friends, there's a lot more compassion. You can understand how a person might find themselves in that situation, even though they didn't want to be in it. And I think it also helps them understand, helps bright people understand just how hard society really is for people who are below average in intelligence. I don't know how it is in Europe, but the United States, our tax system is so horribly complex. I found an easy way to get out of it. I have a computer program do my taxes. I know some people who hire an accountant do it. Oh, it's no problem. The complexity of the tax code doesn't hit me. It does hit someone who can't afford that program or doesn't understand why they need to file in order to get a refund. If you just leave yourself to your own devices, more likely than not, you're only going to mingle with people who are about as intelligent as you are. I think that's harmful just as much as people only mingling with others who are the same race or the same religion or the same socioeconomic status as themselves. In my town, there's 2 universities in the town that total about 60 or 70,000, probably about 60,000 students combined. And so parking is awful, and every business has signs up for customers only. You will be towed, after these hours. And so everybody has been towed. Their car's been towed at least once, and it's expensive to get your car out of towing. And for me, that's an inconvenience. Oops, I didn't see the sign. Dang it. But then when you talk to someone who doesn't have a car for a month because the sign was so complex for customers only, except after 8 p.m., but not on weekends, you realize, oh my gosh, our parking situation is even punishing people with low IQ. And this person, they didn't want their car to get towed, but through no fault of their own, they couldn't understand the regulations at that spot. And now they have to suffer the consequences. It really opens your eyes. It's something that to me is a minor inconvenience, is a major hindrance to being able to function well day to day in my community for a lot of people. And you don't even realize that if you're above average intelligence until you talk with someone and have those people in your life.
6. Does COVID-19 vaccination lower IQ?
There's no reason to believe, but man, vaccine mandates and passports and things do sure bring out the crazy in people. I've noticed that high IQ does not prevent some people from becoming crazy. There's no biological reason to think that the vaccine would harm the brain at all. And I will tell you one thing that does lower IQ, it's dying from COVID. So, get the vaccine because you'd rather be alive than not.
Thank you for your collaboration. Goodbye.